When we talk about the impacts of climate change, it's easy to focus on the physical damages, the floods, the fires, the droughts, but behind every one of these events are real people, real ecosystems, and real systems that are vulnerable. Experiencing climate change isn't just something happening far away or in the distant future. Many of us have already lived through it. Hotter summers, unpredictable winters, worsening storms. The planet's baseline is shifting under our feet. Today, we're going to explore the human dimensions of climate impacts, looking at who and what is most vulnerable and why. As global temperatures rise, it's not only the averages that change. We're seeing entire baselines move. Winters are getting warmer, growing seasons are changing, and extreme events are becoming more common. What used to be rare, like a 100-year flood, is now happening every decade or even more frequently. This shift matters because all of our systems, our crops, our infrastructure, our cities have been built with certain climatic expectations. When the baseline shifts, the systems we depend on are thrown into chaos. Scientists use something called a climate impact assessment to try to understand and predict these changes. These assessments gather information from many fields: atmospheric science, hydrology, ecology, sociology, even economics. The goal here is to answer key questions like where are impacts most likely to occur, how severe might they be, and who or what will be most affected. But a key challenge is making sure that this information is not just accurate, but also accessible and inclusive. This is where new approaches like co-production come in. Instead of treating scientists as the only experts, co-production values local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and lived experiences. A coastal homeowner describing how the high tide now floods their street every month gives us vital insight into how sea level rise is already reshaping lives. Another approach is called post-normal science. This recognizes that science doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's influenced by political, social, and ethical values. In a world of uncertainty and urgent decision-making, science has to engage with communities and policymakers in real time. It's not just about publishing a paper, it's about supporting decisions that will affect people's futures. When we talk about climate impacts, it's important to realize that these are not spread evenly across the globe or even within a single community. Climate change interacts with existing inequalities, making some groups far more vulnerable than others. For example, sea level rise will affect all coastal areas, but the impacts will be especially devastating for small island nations, low-lying cities, and marginalized communities who lack the resources to adapt or relocate. Researchers use terms like low elevation coastal zones, or LECZs, to describe places at greatest risk. Currently, about 896 million people live in these zones, and that number is expected to pass 1 billion by 2050. Meanwhile, rising seas aren't just about losing land. They bring saltwater intrusion into fresh water supplies, threaten agriculture, undermine roadways and ports, and can damage critical ecosystems like mangroves and marshes, which provide natural protections against storms. In places like Bangladesh, Miami, and Jakarta, these impacts are already forcing massive investments in seawalls, as well as pumping systems and relocation plans. Yet many communities just don't have the resources to defend themselves in the same way. Beyond these direct impacts, climate change is reshaping our cultural worlds in ways that are harder to measure, but equally profound. Think about heritage sites, sacred spaces, or the traditional seasonal rhythms that guide farming, festivals, and migration. As climate baselines shift, so do these cycles. The melting of glaciers in Peru, for instance, isn't just an environmental event. It deeply affects the cultural identity and spiritual beliefs of the Quechua people, whose stories, ceremonies, and livelihoods are tied to the mountains. This concept is called place attachment, the emotional and cultural bonds people form with the places they live. As these places are threatened or transformed, people can experience grief, loss, and disconnection, which in turn impacts mental health and social cohesion. When seasonal rhythms shift, it's not just crops that are disrupted, it's entire ways of life. A spring festival tied to a specific flower's blooming may no longer align with nature's new schedule. Migratory species that communities depend on for food or ceremonies might not arrive when expected, or at all. On top of the shifting baselines and slow-moving transformations, we're also seeing a dramatic rise in extreme events, things like floods, wildfires, and heat waves. In scientific language, we often talk about two categories here: slow onset events and compound events. Slow onset events include things like droughts and desertification, long, gradual processes that stress ecosystems and communities over time. Compound events, on the other hand, happen when multiple climate hazards occur simultaneously or in quick succession, multiplying their impacts. Think about a hurricane hitting during a time of drought, or a flood followed by a heat wave that makes recovery efforts even more dangerous. The evidence shows that extreme events are becoming both more frequent and more severe. Flooding, for instance, has dramatically increased around the world. In 2022 alone, catastrophic floods in Pakistan displaced millions and destroyed critical infrastructure, while historic floods in Germany and Belgium caused widespread devastation in areas that had never before experienced such intense rain events. In many cases, the people most affected are those least equipped to recover: small farmers, urban poor, indigenous communities, who often live in the most vulnerable areas. Heat waves, too, are becoming deadlier. In 2003, a European heat wave killed more than 22,000 people, mostly in France. More recently, in 2022, Europe and parts of the United Kingdom experienced temperatures so extreme that national red warnings were issued for the first time. And it's not just Europe. Heat waves in Pakistan and Iran have pushed temperatures above 53 degrees Celsius or 128 degrees Fahrenheit, creating conditions nearly impossible for human survival. Wildfires, driven by hotter, drier conditions, are expanding in range and intensity. The global mean fire season has lengthened by nearly 19% over the past few decades. Events like Australia's Black Summer fires of 2019 and 2020 destroyed millions of acres of forest, killed or displaced billions of animals, and devastated communities. But it's important to realize that these fire risks aren't just natural disasters. They are shaped by how societies manage land, forests, and development. Climate change exacerbates the risks, but human decisions often make them worse. Extreme events are also compounding with other systemic stresses. For example, after Hurricane Sandy hit the U.S. East Coast in 2012, the combination of rising sea levels and intense storm surges caused record flooding in places like New York City, knocking out power for millions and shutting down major financial centers. These kinds of compound events strain not just physical infrastructure, but also social systems, emergency services, food supplies, medical care, all of which are critical during a crisis. As we try to predict and respond to extreme events, it's vital to remember that not all communities have equal resilience. Wealthier areas obviously can invest in stronger levees, better emergency response systems, and rebuilding efforts. When we think about why some groups are more vulnerable to climate impacts than others, we have to talk about vulnerability assessments. These assessments try to untangle the complex web of factors that influence who is most at risk. Vulnerability isn't just about living near the coast or in a wildfire zone. It's also about socioeconomic factors like income, age, health, education, race, and access to resources. Researchers often break vulnerability down into three main components: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure means being in harm's way, like living near a river that's prone to flooding. Sensitivity refers to how badly you're affected once an event happens. Are you elderly, very young, dealing with a health condition that might make heat waves more dangerous, for example? And adaptive capacity is your ability to cope, respond, and recover. Do you have insurance, a strong social network, access to emergency information and evacuation resources? Loss and damages are the real-world outcomes when vulnerability and exposure meet extreme events. They go far beyond property damage. They include injuries, loss of cultural heritage, economic instability, psychological trauma, and even death. In places like New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina or Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, we've seen how systemic vulnerabilities like poor infrastructure, inequality, and historic disinvestment can magnify the scale of disaster far beyond what the storm alone would have caused. Another critical concept is intersecting vulnerabilities. People are often vulnerable in multiple overlapping ways. An elderly woman of color living in a flood-prone neighborhood may face greater risks than a younger, wealthier person elsewhere. The concept of intersectionality, developed by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, helps us understand how discrimination based on race, gender, class, and other identities combine to shape people's risks and experiences of climate change. Studies have shown, for example, that in Lagos, Nigeria, low-income women were among the groups hardest hit by major floods, not just because of where they lived, but because of systemic barriers to mobility, emergency assistance, and post-disaster recovery. In the face of these realities, human security becomes a central concern. Human security means more than national security or the protection of borders. It's about the ability of individuals and communities to meet their basic needs for food, water, health, housing, and just general safety. As the impacts of climate change intensify, threats to human security will grow, often acting as threat multipliers that exacerbate existing stresses, such as poverty, political instability, or social unrest. Take food security, for instance. Having enough safe, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food is something many of us take for granted, but climate change threatens this on multiple fronts. Rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, and more extreme events directly impact crop yields, livestock health, and fisheries. Staple foods like maize, wheat, and rice, cornerstones of global nutrition, are increasingly vulnerable to drought and heat waves. In 2021 alone, between 720 and 828 million people worldwide were estimated to be undernourished, with the largest burdens falling on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. At the same time, food insecurity doesn't only mean hunger. In many parts of the world, it also means obesity. When affordable, nutritious food is scarce, people often rely on cheap, calorie-dense foods that contribute to these poor health outcomes. These twin crises, undernourishment and obesity, are stark reminders that food security is about quality as well as quantity. The livelihoods of farmers, farm workers, and small-scale producers are also increasingly at risk. In regions like East Africa, for example, multi-year droughts have devastated harvests, destroyed grazing lands, and pushed millions closer to famine. Subsistence farmers who depend on what they grow to survive are especially vulnerable and often have limited ability to adapt to changing conditions. In turn, national economies that rely heavily on agriculture, like those in much of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Asia and Latin America, also face deepening instability. Water security is another growing concern. More than 2 billion people globally already lack access to safe, sufficient water, and climate change is making this worse. Regions like the Middle East, South Asia, and parts of Africa are experiencing increased water stress as rainfall becomes less predictable, aquifers are depleted, and rivers run dry. For example, persistent drought in Kenya's Turkana County has forced women to walk farther and farther each day to find water, exposing them to greater physical hardship and even risks of violence. Water insecurity isn't just a rural problem, it's also threatening cities. In Cape Town, South Africa, a major drought led officials in 2018 to announce a potential day zero, the day when the city would literally run out of water. Emergency measures were put in place, including severe rationing, but the crisis exposed stark inequalities. Poorer neighborhoods, many of which had historically been underserved due to apartheid-era policies, faced greater burdens and fewer options for coping. Urban water crises are becoming more common. In 2022, Jackson, Mississippi experienced a near total collapse of its water system following floods, compounded by decades of underinvestment in infrastructure. Water outages lasted weeks, and even when service was restored, it often came with boil advisories or unsafe drinking conditions. These incidents reveal the vulnerabilities of racial and economic inequalities and the compounding pressures of climate change. Health security is yet another dimension of climate vulnerability. The World Health Organization defines health broadly as not just the absence of a disease, but a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. Climate change threatens health directly and indirectly. Rising temperatures expand the ranges of disease-carrying insects like mosquitoes and ticks, leading to increases in illnesses like malaria, dengue fever, and Lyme disease. Wildfires produce smoke that exacerbates respiratory illnesses like asthma. Extreme heat events trigger spikes in hospitalizations and deaths, particularly among the elderly, the very young, and those with pre-existing conditions. Mental health impacts are also becoming more visible. People who experience climate disasters often suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and feelings of hopelessness. Even the chronic stress of living with ongoing climate threats, like living in a community slowly losing land to sea level rise, can take a heavy toll on mental health and community resilience. At the same time, we see the emergence of a broader phenomenon called eco-anxiety, a pervasive worry about the future of the planet that can affect people even if they have not personally experienced a climate disaster. This psychological burden is particularly acute among younger generations who feel they are inheriting a world of mounting risks with few clear solutions. All of these dimensions, food, water, health, psychological well-being, are interconnected. When one area becomes insecure, others often follow. Water shortages lead to crop failures, which lead to food shortages, which exacerbate health crises. In this way, climate change acts as a systemic risk, rippling through multiple sectors and exposing the fragility of systems we often take for granted. Another core dimension of climate vulnerability is housing security. Safe, affordable housing is essential for well-being, yet climate change threatens both the physical structures we live in and the broader housing systems that support communities. As extreme weather events like floods, hurricanes, and wildfires become more frequent and severe, they destroy homes, displace communities, and create long-term instability. It's important to recognize that not everyone has the same access to secure housing even before disaster strikes. Globally, about 1.6 billion people live in inadequate housing, situations that might include informal settlements or overcrowded, unsafe conditions. Many of these homes are located in areas highly exposed to climate risks, such as floodplains, steep slopes, or coastlines. In places like sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, informal settlements often lack reliable access to clean water, electricity, sewage systems, emergency services, making it even harder for residents to prepare for or recover from climate impacts. In cities like New York, we've seen how vulnerable housing can become a deadly issue. During Hurricane Ida in 2021, several people drowned in illegally converted basement apartments that flooded rapidly. These kinds of tragedies reveal how systemic inequalities in housing access and quality can intersect with climate hazards to produce devastating outcomes. Another concept that's important here is climate gentrification. As awareness grows about which neighborhoods are most exposed to climate risks, property values can shift. In some cases, historically disadvantaged neighborhoods, located at higher elevations, become newly desirable, leading to rising rents and the displacement of longtime residents. At the same time, lower-income residents may be pushed into cheaper areas that are actually more vulnerable to floods, heat waves, or wildfires, exacerbating cycles of risk and inequality. When climate impacts destroy housing stock or drive up costs, we see increases in homelessness and housing insecurity. In the United States alone, over 500,000 individuals experience homelessness on any given night, and many of these individuals are especially vulnerable to extreme weather. Exposure to cold snaps, heat waves, floods, and storms poses serious risks to those without stable shelter. Beyond individual displacement, climate change is also a growing driver of migration at larger scales. Every year, millions of people are forced to move, either temporarily or permanently, because of extreme events like floods, droughts, or hurricanes. In 2022, the historic flooding in Pakistan displaced more than 8 million people. In some cases, people can return to their homes after recovery efforts, but in many others, especially when disasters are recurrent or recovery is slow, migration becomes permanent. The term climate refugees is sometimes used to describe people displaced by environmental changes, though it's important to note that international law does not yet formally recognize this term. Many people who migrate due to climate stresses face additional barriers to resettlement, employment, education, and social support, particularly if they cross national borders. Indigenous communities, small island nations, and rural populations are among those most at risk of displacement. Rising seas, desertification, and intensifying storms threaten their homes and ways of life. In some cases, entire villages are already planning or undertaking managed retreats to higher ground. But leaving ancestral lands behind comes with profound cultural and emotional losses, highlighting once again that climate change is not just an environmental or economic issue. It's deeply tied to identity, belonging, and heritage. Vulnerability is patterned by social, economic, political, and historical forces. Colonialism, racism, gender discrimination, and economic exploitation have created the conditions that make some communities more exposed and less able to adapt. As we move forward, it's also essential to recognize the agency, resilience, and leadership within vulnerable communities themselves. Indigenous peoples, grassroots organizers, frontline workers, these groups are not simply victims of climate change. They are often at the forefront of climate adaptation and innovation. Many have long histories of adapting to environmental change and offer critical knowledge, strategies, and advocacy for building a more just and sustainable future. Climate adaptation strategies increasingly emphasize community-based adaptation, which involves working with affected communities to develop solutions that are locally relevant, culturally appropriate, and rooted in local knowledge systems. For example, rather than imposing a top-down flood protection project, community-based adaptation would involve engaging local residents in planning, designing, and maintaining infrastructure improvements, ensuring that the projects truly serve their needs and reflect their priorities. Rather than viewing adaptation as merely reactive, we can envision it as transformative, opening paths to a better future, not just for some, but for all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.